You're about to discover 6 signs that strongly suggest that cruising is not starting up anytime soon. I'm Gary Bembridge. This is another of my cruising tips for travelers. I want to talk about 6 signs that I've seen that I think suggest really strongly that cruising is not going to be starting up soon, despite what you're seeing in terms of when cruise lines are saying they're going to be starting up again. And in fact, even when you can be booking cruises not that far out. I believe very strongly there are a couple of things that show that this is just not going to happen, despite a lot of people hoping that it will do. At the moment, cruise lines are cancelling roughly month by month. And that's really not to do with when they think cruising can start again, but to do with managing the whole process of cancellations and refunds. Every time they cancel, there's an enormous impact. Bear in mind, there's roughly about 600,000 people normally on a cruise every single week. So every time they cancel a couple of weeks, that's an enormous amount of money that's likely to leave the corporations. It's also a huge complex task. So that's really why they're doing it. So let's take a look at the 6 signs that I believe show really strongly that cruising is not going to be starting up for quite some time, starting with this one. First of all, the cruise line executives are actually saying as much. They're basically saying that cruising is not starting up soon. In all the interviews with the CEOs and the chairmen of the cruise lines, what they're saying very clearly is they have no idea when cruising is going to be starting up again. They have no idea when it's going to be allowed. They don't know how many ships are going to be involved. They don't know what regions are going to be involved. They don't know what ports are going to be open. They don't know what the protocols are. They just don't know. And there's a couple of key indicators very specifically that I want to talk about. So if you actually look online, Richard Fain, who's the chairman and CEO of Royal Caribbean, he has a YouTube channel which he's created, which is called Loyal to You Always, where he posts updates. And in those updates, he does talk about just not really knowing how soon and when cruising will start up again. So that's, of course, different to a date that gets published as they cancel cruises. Secondly, at the time of recording, there was an interview with the CEO of the Carnival Corporation. So they look after Carnival, Cunard, Princess, Holland America, Seabourn, AIDA. They basically have 50% market share of everybody who goes cruising is on a Carnival brand. In a recent interview, Arnold Donald, the CEO, basically said that he has no idea when cruising will start up again. And a lot of that's going to depend on when they're allowed to start up again and also when people want to start cruising again. The CEO of Norwegian Cruise Line, Frank Del Rio, so Norwegian, they look after Norwegian, Oceania, Region 7 Seas. Again, he, in a recent statement, which was around when they had to post an update on what's happening with them financially, he again said there's a complete lack of clarity around when cruising will be ready and able and willing to start again. Even closer to home to where I am at the moment in the UK, the managing director of Fred Olsen Cruises, Peter Deer, he again said, we have no idea when the virus is going to be in a situation when the governments are going to allow us to cruise again. And so what they're actually doing is they now don't even announce changes. They're just constantly on a rolling basis out cancelling cruises 30 days ahead. So it's very clear that the heads of the big cruising corporations are saying they do not know when cruising is going to start again. So those dates you see online for resumption of service is literally a placeholder. It's helping them manage expectations and certainly more importantly, managing the whole process of cancellations. Following on for that, the second key sign is actually what physically the cruise lines are doing. And not a lot of this stuff gets a large amount of publicity, but there's 3 critical things that the cruise lines are doing that really indicate that they're not planning to be cruising soon. First of all of the big corporations are raising an enormous amount of money. Now, that's all coming from the private sector because governments are not providing in bailout money to cruise lines because of the fact that they are registered as flags of convenience in kind of tax efficient, tax haven centers, depending on what your views of those are. So they're not getting government help. They're going out and raising an enormous amounts of money. So if you look at recent filings, which they have to do to the stock exchange in the US, where most of these corporations are listed, you'll find that they're raising billions and billions of dollars to cover them for an extended shutdown. And depending on which reports you'll see and some of the analyst reports I've seen, they're talking about cruise lines having made sure they can cover at least into next year having no revenue. So they're structuring financially on the basis they're going to have no revenue. So that's one key indicator. But probably even more importantly is, secondly, they are starting to move many of their ships into what's known as a cold layup. Now, cold layup is when they basically turn down a ship. So they send all non-essential crew home. They basically keep maintenance crew, engineering crew. A lot of the machinery is shut down, and they're basically ticking over at a really low level. Once you go into cold layup, that takes a long time, takes a good couple of weeks to then get the ships back and ready, just from a engineering point of view, from a maintenance point of view, and then of course actually from a crew point of view. That leads me on to the third thing they're doing, is all of the cruise lines are doing in a massive move of sending all of their crew home. Now, because of the restrictions in the US where most of these ships were, is they can't take them off the ship and fly them home. So all of the major cruise lines are moving crew onto ships and sailing them home. So ships are heading towards Europe, they're heading towards Asia, and they're taking crew home. So they're basically sending crew home, and there's no plans to bring crew back. So if they were planning to start sailing in a couple of weeks' time or even a month's time, they would not be basically stripping the ships of the ability to get into service quickly, and they certainly would be keeping the crew on board. So there's very key things in place showing that cruising is not able to start, or not planning to start, quickly and easily. The third key sign is that there are no key agreements yet on what the protocols are going to be for who can go on board, what the screening protocols are going to be, what the safety protocols are going to be, what the actual procedures are going to be on board. So the whole structure and processes and facilities and the way that the onboard experience is going to work has not been agreed. And cruising will not be allowed to start until that's been agreed. Now, in the US, which is really driving a lot of this, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, has basically set down a remit to the cruising industry where they're talking about screening, testing, change of the medical facilities to become much more hospital-like, procedures in terms of if outbreaks happen, having a hospital area, a quarantining area, which could be separate ships. There's lots and lots of discussions around medical certificates for vulnerable and 70 plus passengers. None of that has been agreed. There's been lots of discussions around what that could look like, but has not been agreed. Until those procedures are agreed and signed off, the no-sail orders are not going to be lifted, and that hasn't been agreed. And if you look at the different submissions and what the different lines are saying, they're all saying slightly different things. Now, of course, behind the scenes, I'm sure through CLIA, the Cruise Line Association, they're having one point of view and one perspective, but the procedures are not agreed. And there is some structural and financial and resource and people issues around some of these changes, around having separate hospital ships, around creating more medical centers which have the ability to have ventilators, intensive care units, and that has not been agreed, whether it's structural changes that have to be into the ship or just admin changes. That has not been agreed, and that is a key sign that until that's agreed, cruising will not be able to get back into service. The next key sign, I believe very strongly, is showing that cruising is not going to start soon, is not only is cruising not on the agenda, but travel generally is not on the agenda. What we're seeing is countries are starting to look at easing lockdowns, moving out of the very strict lockdown. But when you look at what's happening in that process, it's very tentative, it's very slow, it's very cautious. So not all shops are opening. In some countries, hairdressers are opening. But what we're seeing is a very key message that social distancing is going to be a fundamental part of that. And there's going to be restrictions on gatherings of people. There's talking about, sports being played behind closed doors without crowds. It's even talking about, clubs and bars being really restricted, restaurants being restricted, anything where people are coming together. It's highly unlikely that we're going to see a sign off quite soon that large groups of people can board cruise ships when they can't even go to concert venues or other venues. Also linked to that, of course, in terms of social distancing, is how you're going to manage that on a cruise ship. It's hard enough even on land, but when you've got big concentrations of people, and that still has to be really worked through before cruising can start. Also importantly linked to that is travel generally is not opening. We're already seeing that the airlines are constantly postponing and indicating that they don't believe they're going to be running full services. The airline industry, of course, is really important because a lot of people will be flying into ports, whether that's cross-border or even internally to get to the cruise lines and onto cruises. So if that infrastructure is not up and running, it's going to be hard for cruises to start up until that whole infrastructure is in place. And even in the airline industry, they can't even agree yet what the process is going to be for people boarding planes. So there's still lots of discussion around what those testing or screening protocols are going to be. What we're also seeing, many tourist ministers across the globe are basically indicating to people they shouldn't really expect to be doing cross-border travel during this summer, perhaps even into the late part of the year. They're indicating that there may be some potential to do more domestic travel within a country, which can be more controlled. So it's really hard to see that cruising and travel generally is really going to be unlocking any time soon. Also, a very interesting point is if you think in the run-up to the shutdown, there was very strong restrictions on movement of people around the world, or even boarding things like aeroplanes or cruise ships, where at that time they were banning people who'd been to or from China, from South Korea, from Vietnam, from Cambodia. Now, if you look many months later, the big areas that have had huge issues with the virus, so in the United States, in North America, and in Europe, those are big concentrations where the virus has had a huge effect. So it's also very likely that you might find there's restrictions on letting people from those countries move around and join cruises. So that is also a really fundamental point, is whether actually the key heart of cruising passengers are not allowed to move around. And I have seen some interviews with some of the river cruising people in Europe saying one of their big challenges, they think, in starting river cruising again is the bulk of their passengers come from North America, but it's very likely that the borders in Europe are going to be closed to people coming from North America for quite a long time, certainly towards the end of the year. The next key hurdle or sign that cruising is going to struggle to start anytime soon is there's still a lot of hostility and a lot of political pressure on the whole area of cruising. So if you look in Australia, they started criminal investigations into the Ruby Princess and what happened around that whole process of bringing COVID-19 into Australia. We're seeing a lot of hostility still from the CDC in the US, which is, of course is negotiating with the cruise lines. If you look at some of the statements from the group within there that looks after the cruising industry, they've been pretty hostile towards cruising, still seeing cruising as a major challenge, a major issue in terms of keeping the virus under control and spreading the virus. So there's a lot of hostility from the sort of authorities that need to sign off cruising starting, and there's no sign of that easing yet. And I do think that cruising is going to be low on their priorities in terms of getting that moving again. And of course, cruising can't start until they've got all of those authorities on side. Another key sign is that despite all the excitement, and certainly with people like me, a lot of people who follow the channel and have enthusiasm for cruising, overall, there's not a huge energy and push for cruising to start again. Of course, those of us who love cruising, we have high energy and interest in it starting. But if you look at some of the stats, for example, in some of the recent filings, we've seen that over 50% of people whose cruises have been cancelled want their money back. They're not taking future cruise credits, which means a big chunk of people are actually saying, I want my money, I'm not prepared to take a future cruise credit because I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing again. The other thing we're seeing is all the cruise lines in their financial statements are talking about 2020 being very soft in terms of cruising. Lots of people cancelling cruising as they can or shifting cruising. When we look at next year, although the buzz has been around all bookings are really strong, when you look at the data again through those financial submissions, is actually it's pretty flat. And what we're seeing is, I think, quite a big issue, because if you think about the amount of people that have future cruise credit, even with the 50% of people taking it, if they're starting to look at 2021 and it's pretty flat, there are still signs that there's not a huge amount of energy yet for a broader perspective of people to get back to cruising. And one of the things that the cruise line CEOs have said, linking back to my first point, is until the people and public are really keen to get back to cruising, the way that cruising comes back is going to be limited, because they can't actually go out all guns blazing with lots of ships, lots of regions, if there's not a huge amount of people who want to go cruising. There's a whole bunch of signs out there that cruising is not going to start for some time. So even if you get excited and you see the new announcements of dates for a month's time about cruising started, I think you need to be extremely cautious, because I think that it's very unlikely that cruising is going to start quickly. Of course, I may be proven wrong and a lot of these things will be solved and things will start moving quickly. But those are the signs that I see. I have loads more videos with lots of tips, advice, thoughts about cruising. And so why don't you watch another one of those right now?